are not safe in deep water in particular. So there's three things that we're doing with this campaign that we're launching today. Firstly is to raise awareness of the issue. So colours that can't be seen in the water are blues, whites and light greys. Secondly, we're asking parents to really think about the colour of swimwear that they pack for their children for their summer holidays this year. So think about bright colours, oranges, greens, reds, neons, lots of options out there. And thirdly, we're asking everyone to sign our petition. It's on change.org today, calling on the government to legislate really against these unseeable colours because, as we said, they really are invisible in deep water and in swimming pools. And actually, most swimwear that parents own is in exactly the worst colours for child safety. So 2/3 of parents know that their children are likely to be wearing navies, blues, whites and greys. So really, it's a chance for us to spread this message today and ask people to check their swimwear, have a look at the brighter colours you've got, maybe swap with other families if you need to for holidays, or perhaps even buy some new swimwear to make sure your children are as visible and as safe as possible this summer. And we haven't yet found a retailer that is not selling those dangerous colours. So really, it's a real opportunity for parents to do that little extra thing. As you say, it's quite, there's a lot to think about, isn't there, on holiday anyway? Hard to keep your eye on two children at the same time, or three, or however many you've got. So every little bit you can do to help keep them safe, we think is worth knowing about and worth doing this summer. We had an article that was shared with us last year, actually, on the subject, and it was quite unbelievable, which is why we redid the research ourselves to see for ourselves how much of an issue this is. And as you saw from the pictures, it really is difficult to see those colours in the water.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. In the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with political journalist and broadcaster Theo Usherwood and Ava Santina Evans, political correspondent at Politics Joe. So let's see what's on some of those front pages for you now. On the front of the Financial Times, Le Pen's far right defeats Macron in first round of French snap election. The Telegraph headlines her speech declaring that her National Rally party has practically wiped out Emmanuel Macron. That's Marine Le Pen. The Metro is leading with Euro celebrations after England beat Slovakia 2-1 earlier this evening. The Sun features Bellingham's goal with the headline "Saved by the Bell." Meanwhile, the Star highlights England's two goal scorers who sent the team through to the quarter-finals in dramatic fashion. The Mirror's headline, "England keeps the dream alive." The Daily Mail leads with a warning to voters from the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, not to lock Labour into power for a generation. The Express leads with former Business Secretary Kemi Badenoch telling the paper that she feels heartbroken when Tory voters turn to the Reform Party. The Guardian reports on the Labour leader's vow that his party will restore the public's faith in British politics. The Eye leads with a warning from expert economists to both major parties that the UK is heading towards stagnation after the election. And a reminder that by scanning the QR codes you'll see on screen during the programme, you can check out the front pages of tomorrow's newspapers while you watch us. And we are joined tonight by Theo Ashwood and Ava Santina Evans. Welcome to both of you. Let's start with The Guardian. And this is Labour's pledge should they come into power. They're saying that they can stem the populist threat. Expand, Theo.
So this is Keir Starmer talking about his plan and what the difference, I think, between Starmerism and perhaps Blairism, and the idea that actually he wants to see substantive improvements to public services to make people's lives better. And that is ultimately the way he sees it, that he's going to see off populism, namely Nigel Farage and Reform UK. He says that populism is based in this disaffection, this sense that politics cannot be a force for good and you can't trust politicians. And I think there's a sense of truth to this, that often when you look at why people are unhappy and you look at, say, and then you compare it to, say, the talking points of the far right or right, extreme right-wing politics, they'll often latch on to disaffection with public services. So, for instance, we had in the House of Commons a few months ago, somebody was talking, it was actually a Conservative MP, was talking about, nurses in the NHS not speaking English. I've never heard a member of the public ever say that, but actually, if you look at waiting lists, people are saying, or they're looking at waiting lists, or they're looking at waiting times in A&E stretching beyond 4 hours now, up to 12 hours. Even people waiting as long as a day. People are really concerned, aren't they, about public services? And then what you have is that this gives rise to, or it gives cause to those on the right of politics, on the extreme right of politics, even those on the extreme left of politics, to make political capital by blaming, whether it's immigrants or anybody else for that matter, rather than dealing with the substantive issues of why public services are suffering. And that's why Starmer has identified this, that if he can actually improve people's lives, Farage, Reform UK, that's going to simply go away because they're not going to be able to get that leverage.
Ava, but do we have details how you kind of address this disillusionment from the public in terms of their view of British politics?
Well, I'm not quite sure that Keir Starmer is quite abreast of why. He sort of identified the problem, but he hasn't quite got on board with the solution. So he understands that there's a disaffection with politics, and he understands that, people are sort of moving away from politicians because they don't trust them, but he hasn't quite managed to understand why. I mean, I would take a guess, and I would say something on the lines of there are large swathes of the population who have been ignored during this election, particularly people who are under 35, and we are going to come on to a story about France shortly, but, that's really what you're seeing, in parts of Europe. People who are under 35 who have been largely ignored for quite some time, who are angry. And unfortunately, they're, people who are in the far right, they do spot a gap in the market there and they do tend to target them. And this is something that actually Nigel Farage, I'm not saying that he is far right, but Nigel Farage has actually been sort of tapping into. We've had various conversations with him over the past few weeks, and he does speak about young people, and he does speak about people who are carrying a large portion of the tax burden. He does know the sort of pinch points to go after.
Let's move to the FT. You mentioned, Ava, what's happening in France. The headline there, Le Pen's far right defeats Macron in first round of French snap election, and the photo there of Marine Le Pen, and she's basically claiming that they've decimated Emmanuel Macron's centrist party. Theo?
I mean, this was Macron's big gamble after those disastrous European election results. He said, well, let's go to the polls, let's try and galvanise the left of French politics and secure a victory. The idea was that if people would come together, see the threat of the far right in France, that he could actually defeat Marine Le Pen once and for all. And going by the results in the first round of these parliamentary elections, it's utterly failed. His own party has come third. I think what's interesting, actually, particularly about the FT's article, is that it starts to look at some of the implications of this first round of voting, and they talk about the fact that maybe in the second round there is perhaps a glimmer of hope that the left and the centre-left may come together as one to try and defeat Le Pen. But more importantly, in France, we're going to end up with Marine Le Pen's Prime Minister from the National Rally taking over in the Parliament. And is there going to be an encroachment on Emmanuel Macron's own authority when it comes to dealing with foreign policy as president, when it comes to dealing with the armed forces as well. What impact is that going to have on the financial markets? What impact is that going to have on the stability of Europe ultimately? Because there are serious questions now as to whether Macron, the coming weeks is going to be able to continue as president of France.
And Ava, the gamble that Thea was saying that Macron has taken absolutely hasn't paid off.
It's a rather extraordinary gamble, isn't it? But, Marine Le Pen has now secured 3 times the vote that she secured in 2022. It almost has the hallmarks in terms of purely politically, not in terms of the, the sentiment, but it almost feels like the sort of 2017 election that we had here in Britain, where Theresa May took a gamble thinking that perhaps she'd be able to scoop up a few more seats, and actually it catastrophically went not in her favour.
So the best case scenario would be a hung Parliament for Macron, do we think?
So I think he's going to have to work with, Macron is going to have to work with a Parliament that's ultimately probably going to be controlled by a national rally, but he's at the same time, they're going to be in charge, the Parliament's going to be in charge of domestic policy, and he's going to be in charge of the armed forces and foreign policy, and there's going to be this continued friction, and we're going to start to see Marine Le Pen's party start to put pressure on Macron when it comes to his own responsibilities as president of France. Is Macron going to be able to continue in that way? And ultimately, Marine Le Pen, she hasn't stood in these elections. She's got her eyes on a bigger prize, which is to be president of France.
Let us move. We'll stay with politics, but we'll get Kemi Badenoch's take on the influence of Reform UK. It's the front page of the Daily Express. She says she's heartbroken when her Conservatives' colleagues say that they intend to vote for reform.
Yes, so her heart is breaking apparently, because all hopes of either Reform Member of Parliament are dashed. There's no hope of getting a Reform candidate elected, she says. Even in her seat, she's worried that she's got a 20,000 majority, that they could lose a Conservative MP because people are turning to the Reform Party. And, actually what she's saying there is very interesting, because if you look at Rishi Sunak and the campaign that he has led over the past few weeks, he has been going to seats with extraordinary majorities. I think the average was around 14,000 majorities in each of the seats that he's been visiting and been canvassing in. He was even actually spotted in his own constituency campaigning, which is very unusual for a Conservative MP. This sort of feels sort of like a last-ditch attempt by a Conservative MP to convince people to stay with the Tory party and not to do a sort of protest vote and turn to reform.
Yeah, Theo, she's saying that the Conservatives can still turn this around.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about this is, if you think back to last week, and I think Rishi Sunak was absolutely right to call it out, the comments made in that undercover documentary, and also previous comments, made by likes of the Home Secretary James Cleverly about reform, is that reform, and from certain quarters of the Conservative Party, and reform and Nigel Farage is somehow seen as dirty words, that somehow you don't want to go, Conservative voters don't want to go near them, don't touch them. They're sort of, they're not to be messed with, they're not to be invited in. And I think what Kemi Badenoch has identified here is that it's all very well saying that you're repulsed by reform, but actually you need to get some of those voters back. And if you're saying that you don't like them, then that's not exactly a strategy to try and persuade them to vote for your party. What she's saying here is actually, my heart breaks. And actually, I'd love those people to come back. They're good Conservative voters. That's what she's saying to them. Come back to the party, vote Conservative, don't vote Reform, rather than just trying to distance herself or distance the Conservative Party from them. And of course, she's a potential leadership candidate after this election. And I think it's going to be interesting to see. I think this is a sort of wider narrative that I think is going to feed in to her own leadership campaign, which we would presume would take place shortly after, presuming, of course, Keir Starmer is elected Prime Minister on Friday.
But of course they benefited from this in 2019, didn't they? Because the Brexit Party were pulling the same sort of stunts, and they were quite happy to take their votes then, because the Brexit Party acquiesced, and this time it hasn't quite turned out like that.
But that was what Boris Johnson managed to do, because he managed to convince Farage that his best interest was to stand aside. But this time around, Rishi Sunak hasn't pulled it off, has he?
Theo and Ava, thank you very much for the moment. We're going to take a break. Coming up, amongst the stories we'll be discussing, this on the front of the Eye, a warning from economists that the UK is heading for stagnation after the election. We'll be right back with that and other stories. Do stay with us if you can.
Big stories don't always come from big cities. I'm Lisa Dowd and I'm Sky's Midlands correspondent, and this is where I grew up. We can reveal that the driver who hit Harry Dunn is 42-year-old Anne Sakoulas.
Just met the president and we never thought we'd get this far.
This is what they're up against, that the wind is the really big problem. It is back-breaking work and the smoke is thick. It's been working well. Water levels are dropping, but no one knows what impact further rain will have. What would you do if this place wasn't open? We take you to the heart of the stories that shape our world.
It's really scary. We're terrified.
In this community, I'm told that everybody knows someone affected by COVID.
Hopefully this will be the last wave.
I never knew they would make it. It's amazing.
Change seems tantalisingly close in this corner of the UK. Wales was the first to introduce the plastic bag charge. This is my patch, my specialism. It's also my home.
Welcome back. You are watching the press preview. Still with me, political journalist and broadcaster Theo Usherwood and Ava Santina Evans, political correspondent at Politics Joe. Let us have a look at The Sun. We've got to talk about the football. Their headline, Saved by the Bell, and we see photographed there Jude Bellingham performing what I'm told is a bicycle kick to score his goal.
It was a worldie, wasn't it? I think that's the term.
Is that the terminology?
Oh yeah, it's a worldie. I mean, he saved us. He saved England in the 95th minute. I think we were all prepared for another disappointment and Gareth Southgate's imminent resignation after 8 years in charge of England. But somehow Jude Bellingham pulled off the unthinkable, and now we go to the quarter-finals on Saturday against Switzerland. But I think unless we probably improve overall, then I think they're going to undo us, aren't they?
Oh, let's see. I mean, the thing is, fans are not. They're not bowed by the, they're not geared up by the performance, because it was, by all accounts, lacklustre. I saw the first part of it. So they still actually don't have confidence that they can do it next weekend.
But one of the best goals in our country's history, apparently, according to Harry Kane. Yeah. No, that's actually my view. That's my personal view. No, according to Harry Kane, yeah. No, but it does feel like that at the moment, watching the football. I mean, it's like last week, isn't it, when it was sort of, we were sort of being dragged through, a very boring draw. It kind of feels a bit like that, doesn't it? I want a bit more action.
It's a definite win, though.
Yeah.
2-1's a definite win. It's good.
But then what you said about 8 years of Southgate there, what are you sort of making an election government comparison there, are you? We've just had too much stagnation, have we, for too many years. You want to change?
You need change all round.
Southgate out for Theo Usherwood, I think.
No, poor Gareth Southgate, leave him alone.
Segues us on to our next item at the front of the eye, which is talking about stagnation. And dozens, apparently, of economists are warning that either Rishi Sunak or Keir Starmer are failing to offer a serious plan to grow the economy, Theo.
I'd just take you back, actually, just to Ava's original point, just on the front of The Guardian, when she was talking about dealing with populism, and Keir Starmer hasn't actually outlined how he's going to improve public services, what those steps are in terms of getting the economy going. And this is one of the problems that all of us journalists have battled with throughout this election, is that Keir Starmer is making these promises, but actually, when it comes down to the detail, we've got £20 billion of spending cuts, baked in for the next 2 years to unprotected apartments, he hasn't actually been able to specify exactly how he's going to do it because he's set himself with so many fiscal rules, whether it's, of course, not borrowing any more money because he wants to bring down debt as a proportion of GDP over the course of the forecast, locking in VAT, income tax and corporation tax and national insurance, promising not to increase those. And therefore, it's unsurprising, again, those who really focus on these matters, those experts like Paul Johnson, who's the director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, saying that there will be no avoiding tax rises or spending cuts if the economy doesn't improve. And of course, Keir Starmer's big plan initially, and this is what we saw on the front page of the Sunday Times today, was about housing reform, unlocking all the regulations when it comes to building on Greenbelt to try and get the economy firing on all cylinders. But we've been bumping along. Growth has been bumping along at close to zero or just above zero, and really to get this, get the economy going, he needs to get it up to 2 or 3% before anybody feels a real difference. And there's more money in the Treasury that he can actually start to bring in some of his plans that could stave off the populist right, in this case of Nigel Farage.
And Ava, that is the plan, isn't it, that we've heard time and time again to grow the economy?
Well, yeah, and I think, also the public do deserve a better answer than we are going to recoup funds from benefit scroungers. I think we've heard that sort of narrative now for the last 24 years. And even if that were true, say everyone who was receiving PIK payments were actually doing them in bad faith and we were managed to recoup those funds, that doesn't mean that suddenly our public services are going to be awash with a whole load of cash. We've had 14 years now to reverse austerity and to grow the economy. And now neither party are actually offering anything exciting or incentivising. I think, particularly, sorry to go back again to young people, but I think if you are a young person at the moment, the only glimmer of hope that you've got is this house building programme that Labour have been talking about that was on the papers yesterday morning. If that doesn't come through, I think that you're going to see, not physical unrest, but you are going to see some very unhappy people.
Theo, Rishi Sunak, front page of the Daily Telegraph, he's saying that Vladimir Putin is hoping for a Labour victory. How so?
So, yes, I take you back, it was a couple of weeks ago now, there was a Conservative Party social media advert and it had Keir Starmer pictured on the left and then looking over and as appearing to, be interested as to the outcome of this election. You had in this advert, you had the North Korean leader, Vladimir Putin, and the idea was that, they were somehow thinking that Keir Starmer wasn't necessarily going to protect, the British UK national security in the same way that the Tories or Rishi Sunak has done. And this, I think, the focus of this is particularly around making good on the promise to increase defence spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2030. Keir Starmer has said when resources allow. And this was a point that Rishi Sunak made when he was at the G7 a couple of weeks ago, where he was asked questions about, safeguarding or ring-fencing money for Volodymyr Zelensky, the Ukrainian president. He said, well, actually, because we've got this pledge on defence spending, we can do it. Keir Starmer can't do it. So I think that's the premise of it. But I would just point you back to the 2016 Brexit referendum when Lord Cameron, David Cameron, then Prime Minister, said, if we vote to leave the European Union, you can bet that the Vladimir Putin and the people who don't want this country to succeed will be watching very closely. So I don't think it's this is the now Foreign Secretary saying that. So I'm not sure that Sunak is perhaps in the best position to make this claim about Keir Starmer.
OK. Theo and Ava, we must leave it there. We have run out of time. Thank you very much. We'll see you in the 11 o'clock hour. Coming up next on Sky News at 11, England survive a scare against Slovakia at the Euros, setting up a quarter-final against Switzerland.